When celebrated architect Luke Thorne retreats to a sleepy coastal town to rebuild the storm-wrecked house that once symbolized his failed marriage, he expects peace, solitude, and clean lines. But when fiery sailing instructor Marin Callahan insists the house and Luke must embrace the wild unpredictability of the sea, his blueprint for life begins to unravel. If you love fiery tension, seaside settings, and slow-burn passion, like and subscribe for more romance stories that sweep you away. The salt hung thick in the air, clinging to Luke Thorne's skin like the ghost of a memory he didn't ask to relive. As he stepped out of his SUV and onto the sandy gravel that led toward the windswept cliff, his Italian leather shoes crunched against broken shells and dried seaweed. He stared ahead at the skeleton of the house, his house perched stubbornly above the tide. The wind tugged at his collar, sharp with the tang of brine and decay. Shingles peeled like curled paper, the roof slouched inward from years of neglect, and the porch railing had collapsed completely. Where there was once a wraparound balcony kissed by sea spray and summer moonlight, there was now only splintered wood and the low groan of gulls circling overhead. It had once been beautiful. He had made sure of that. Every line, every curve, every detail of the Thorne house had been deliberately a coastal masterpiece, modern but warm, airy but anchored. It was the kind of home that made architecture magazines reach out for features, the kind that made wives smile as they imagined barefoot children and lemonade on breezy afternoons. It was supposed to be the crown jewel of his personal life, a monument to permanence. And now, it sagged like the memory of a failed promise. He dragged a hand through his dark hair, now threaded with more silver than he remembered, and exhaled through his teeth. The wind caught the sound, carried it out over the bluffs, and gave nothing back in return. This was Breakwater Bay. And this was where his marriage ended quietly, subtly, like the way water eroded stone. No screams, no betrayal, just silence and time and absence where connection used to live. Luke shouldered his satchel and crossed the crumbling flagstone path, weeds sprouting defiantly through the cracks. His fingers grazed the tarnished doorknob, cold and salt-bitten. The hinges groaned in protest as he pushed the door open. Dust swirled in the slanting afternoon light like ash in the air after a burn. Inside, the bones of the house remained open beams, soaring ceilings. The unmistakable scent of aged cedar butt time had weathered it. The storm from 2 winters ago had gutted half the interior, and the rest had been left to rot, forgotten amid the paperwork and court filings. He stood still in the foyer, listening to the house breathe. Somewhere above, a loose shutter banged against the siding. Seagulls screamed their irritation at the wind. His phone buzzed in his pocket with a reminder about the contractor meeting at 4, but he silenced it. The past didn't care about appointments. Luke moved to the wide picture window that once framed the Atlantic like a living painting. Now, it was cracked in the corner, spiderwebbed like a warning. Beyond it, the sea glittered in the sharp mid-afternoon light. Silver-blue waves caught the wind and curled over themselves, tumbling toward the shore in endless rhythm. It was wild, raw, the opposite of the neat, intentional geometry that had defined his career. He hadn't come back for sentiment. Not really. The house had been part of the divorce settlement, left to him like some morbid consolation prize. It was supposed to be a quick trip, assess the damage, hire the right crew, execute the rebuild, and list it for sale before winter. Clean, efficient, like his designs. But the house resisted efficiency. Every corner revealed more rot. The foundation needed reinforcement. The layout, once sleek, now felt sterile, like a showroom instead of a sanctuary. He made a note to rework the plans, maybe open up the back wall and add more light, maybe introduce stone to ground the steel and glass. He stepped outside again, blinking against the brightness. The sound of laughter rolled up from below the bluff, and he squinted toward the small public marina tucked into the cove. A woman stood at the edge of the dock, barefoot in board shorts and a faded tank top, her arms raised as she barked instructions to a group of teenagers fumbling with sails. The kids struggled, ropes tangling in their hands, but the woman moved among them with quick, sure steps, tugging lines, tightening knots. Her voice rang out clear, melodic, and commanding. Even from this distance, Luke could feel the gravitational pull of her energy. She turned, as if sensing him. Their eyes met across the distance, a moment suspended in the breeze. Her expression was unreadable curiosity, maybe, or mild annoyance. Then she turned back to the task at hand, lifting a mainsail with practiced ease. Luke blinked. He didn't know who she was, didn't remember seeing her when he and Margot had come here years ago, but there was something about her, something unscripted. Back inside, he dropped his satchel beside the gutted fireplace and pulled out a stack of blueprints. His sketches for the rebuild were crisp and modern, a blend of steel, reclaimed wood, and glass that respected the ocean without giving in to it. The house would rise again, stronger this time. Unsentimental, a fresh canvas. The door creaked again behind him, and footsteps echoed in the entryway. He turned to find Mason Durant, a contractor he'd worked with once before, wiping his boots on the doormat. "Place looks worse than the photos," Mason said, his voice gravelly, but not unkind. Luke offered a tired half-smile. "It's got character." Mason snorted and surveyed the interior. "Character won't keep the roof up when nor'easter season rolls around. You want my honest opinion? Tear it down and start from scratch." Luke shook his head. "No, I'm rebuilding it. Same footprint, just better." "You always did love a challenge," Mason said, eyeing the blueprints. "You working solo on the design?" Luke hesitated. "Mostly." Mason scratched at his beard. "I might bring someone in for consultation. Local. Knows the water, knows the weather. Could give insight on structural tweaks, especially after what happened 2 winters back." Luke raised an eyebrow. "Someone from town?" "She teaches sailing down at the dock. Knows the coastline like the back of her hand. She's sharp, opinionated as hell, but she's got instincts no textbook can teach." Luke looked back toward the cove where the woman had stood. He could still hear her voice, ringing with conviction, chasing wind and children across the water. There was something feral about her, something untamed and unapologetic. He folded his arms. "She have a name?" Mason smirked. "Marin Callahan." The name settled on Luke's tongue like sea salt. Rough, elemental, familiar in the way danger sometimes is. "Let her take a look," Mason said. "Can't hurt." Luke glanced back toward the sea. The wind picked up again, whistling through the broken windows, curling under his collar. For the first time in months, he didn't feel numb. He felt unsettled, alive. He nodded once, almost to himself. "Fine, let's see what she's got." Luke adjusted the collar of his shirt as the wind swept through the open frame of what used to be the kitchen wall, rustling the edges of the blueprints spread across the makeshift table like restless fingers. The morning sun slanted low and sharp, lighting the dust in the air as if the house itself were breathing. He held down the paper with one hand and tapped a pencil absently against the corner of the page. The lines he'd drawn were crisp and commanding, a clean reimagination of the space, more glass, more light, less of the quaint charm the house once flaunted. It would be sleek and modern this time, rational, controlled. A voice rose from the front path. Female, sharp, not shouting exactly, but firm enough to suggest she wasn't asking permission. "Is this the Thorn place?" Luke looked up as a figure stepped through the yawning doorway, her silhouette outlined against the bright day behind her. She moved like she had somewhere to be, even as she stood still, legs braced slightly apart, shoulders back, a kind of grounded energy radiating off her skin. Her hair was wind-tossed and curling at the edges, sun-bleached in places, as though the sea had marked her as its own. A pair of aviator sunglasses hung from the neckline of her tank top, and her cargo shorts were streaked with something that looked like engine grease. Luke straightened instinctively, sliding the blueprints aside. That depends. Are you here to tell me the house is a lost cause, too? She gave him a quick, assessing look, the kind that seemed to measure not just the man in front of her, but the bones behind him. Nope, not my place to say. Mason just said you wanted a second pair of eyes on the rebuild. I'm Marin Callahan. Luke offered his hand. Luke Thorne. Her grip was firm, warm. Her palms felt rough with calluses, like she worked more with ropes and wood than with pens or keys. She held on a moment longer than necessary, studying him with a tilt of her head before letting go. I figured Mason meant to introduce us in person, Luke said. Mason's busy digging a trench for an outbuilding in someone's goat pasture. I didn't mind stopping by. Her eyes moved around the room, cataloging the fractured walls, the exposed joists, the scattered dust that clung to sunlight like smoke. Her expression didn't betray much, but he noticed the faint shift of her brows, the way her jaw tensed when she looked at the cracked support beam. So, what are you thinking? She asked, nodding toward the blueprints. Gut it? Reinforce and modernize? Luke stepped aside to let her look. She leaned in, one hand on the edge of the table, her scent, subtle and disarming sun-warmed skin, sea salt, and something faintly citrus that clung to her like memory. I want to keep the footprint, he said, but give it a stronger structure, more steel in the frame, floor to ceiling windows facing the ocean, a cleaner aesthetic. The original design relied too heavily on nostalgia. She studied the sketches without speaking, her finger tracing the outlines of the living room, the kitchen, the open deck he'd proposed in the back. You're fighting the wind, she said quietly. I'm managing it. She straightened, turning to face him, her tone calm but firm. You don't manage the wind here. You live with it. You dance with it. You brace for the times it wants to break you. Otherwise, you'll be patching this place again before you've finished paying off the contractors. He didn't answer right away. Her presence unsettled something in him, not because she was wrong, but because she was right in a way that made him bristle. He'd spent his entire career mastering space, balancing light and material to control the way people moved, breathed, felt inside their homes. The ocean didn't get to dictate that. Still, she wasn't done. These supports, she said, tapping a line near the left corner. You're too close to the cliff edge. You need to set them deeper, give the foundation more breadth. The earth here shifts, especially after heavy rain. You think you're building on something stable, but it'll betray you if you don't treat it right. He raised a brow. You're not an architect. She met his gaze without flinching. I'm a sailor. I read wind, water, and terrain better than most. And I've helped rebuild enough storm-damaged cottages to know when someone's trusting too much in their own lines. The comment stung, mostly because he felt the truth of it coil in his chest, but the way she said it wasn't cruel. It was direct, earnest. There was no ego in it, just a woman who knew the land better than he did and wasn't afraid to say so. Luke leaned against the table, folding his arms. So, what would you do differently? Marin stepped closer to the blueprint, her brow furrowed, fingers sliding along the design like she was tracing the edge of a map. She began to speak, low and thoughtful, outlining subtle changes. She talked about wind corridors, load-bearing pivots that allowed the house to shift slightly without cracking, about glass choices that handled salt exposure better, about the emotional texture of a home that felt both grounded and open. He listened, despite himself, and slowly the irritation gave way to something like curiosity. She spoke with a fluid kind of confidence that came not from academic knowledge, but from being in the thick of it, from storms weathered and boats righted and homes saved when most people would have run. I thought you taught sailing, he said finally. I do, and a few other things when the season's slow. This coastline's my home. I've seen what survives here, and what doesn't. There was something else in her voice when she said it, a note of loss so faint he almost missed it. Luke nodded once. Okay, show me. She looked up at him, the wind catching strands of her hair and brushing them across her cheek. For a second, neither of them spoke. The house creaked gently around them, as if listening. You sure? She asked. He didn't hesitate. I didn't come back here just to rebuild walls. Her gaze searched his, slow and deliberate, before she finally nodded. All right, then, she said. Let's see if we can build something that'll hold. The morning broke with a haze that blurred the line between sea and sky. The horizon swallowed in soft gray light as if the world itself hadn't quite woken up. Luke stood barefoot at the edge of the dock, the wood damp and cool beneath his feet, his arms crossed against the chill coming off the water. The smell of brine and damp rope filled his lungs, pulling up something deep and old and unwanted. The sailboat rocked gently in the shallow current, tethered like a restless animal eager to run. Marin moved across its deck with quiet assurance, coiling a rope with one hand while shielding her eyes with the other. Her body moved with the rhythm of the boat, not against it, a kind of unconscious grace born from years of familiarity. She didn't look at him right away. You're early, she said, her voice low and even, not yet colored by challenge or amusement. You said we'd go out at sunrise. She finally turned, her eyes squinting in the morning light, her hair pulled back in a loose knot that already surrendered a few wisps to the sea breeze. There was a dampness on her skin, like she'd already been working or swimming before he arrived. He couldn't quite look away. I didn't think you'd actually come. Luke lifted one shoulder in a half shrug. You said if I wanted to understand the rebuild, I had to understand the water. Marin gestured to the boat with a flick of her chin, then climb aboard. He stepped carefully, uncertain on the bobbing deck, gripping the railing tighter than he needed to. The movement of the boat was unlike anything he controlled. It shifted beneath him like a living thing, every swell of water affecting his balance. He hated the way it made his heart beat harder, the way his muscles tensed in response to forces he couldn't quite predict. She tossed him a life vest. He caught it awkwardly, fumbling with the straps. Have you ever sailed before? She asked. Once, years ago, with my ex-wife. It didn't end well. Marin raised an eyebrow but said nothing, stepping past him to unfasten the mainsail. Her shoulder brushed his as she moved, warm and solid and quick. The scent of salt and something faintly citrus followed her, familiar now in a way that made him think about her more than he wanted to. Keep your feet apart, she said. Bend your knees slightly. Don't lock them. The boat moves. You need to move with it. The instructions were practical, measured. Still, her voice had a texture that slipped under his skin. He did as she said, adjusting his stance as the boat pushed away from the dock, gliding into open water. As the wind caught the sail, the boat surged forward with a grace that surprised him. His stomach dropped, the sensation both exhilarating and deeply uncomfortable. He grabbed for the railing again. Breathe, Marin said, barely looking at him. She adjusted the rudder with one hand, her gaze fixed ahead. You're not going to die. That's very reassuring. You're safe. You're just not in control. Big difference. He shot her a look, but she didn't return it. Her eyes were on the water, on the way the wind rippled across the surface, on distant markers only she could read. She navigated like she belonged out here. Luke realized he had never belonged to any place like that, not even to the homes he designed. As the boat settled into its rhythm, something in him began to loosen. The wind combed through his hair, tugged at the collar of his shirt, cooled the sweat at the back of his neck. The water around them shifted from slate gray to glassy green, laced with sunlight. Seagulls dipped and cried overhead, their voices sharp against the hush of waves slapping the hull. Marin moved beside him, her body close but not touching. You see how the light hits the waves? He nodded. The house you're designing. It's too closed off, too rigid. You're not accounting for the way the sea breathes. It moves. It expands. It reflects everything back. You need to let the ocean in. Otherwise, it'll find its own way. Luke swallowed. The words landed in his chest like something more than advice. He wasn't sure if she was talking about the house anymore. "Maybe I like things that stay where I put them," he said. Maren gave a soft laugh, almost inaudible over the wind. "Then you probably shouldn't be rebuilding a house on a cliff." The sky began to open above them, the haze thinning as the sun rose higher. The light shimmered across the water, dazzling and relentless. Luke leaned against the side of the boat, eyes narrowed. "It's beautiful," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Maren turned toward him, and for the first time since they'd left the dock, her gaze softened. "It's honest," she said. "The sea never pretends to be anything it isn't. You can scream into it, beg it to change, but it never will. You either learn to work with it, or it breaks you." Luke looked at her then, the way her eyes caught the light, how the wind pressed her shirt against her frame, how her voice didn't tremble when she said hard things. She wasn't a soft woman, but there was strength in her softness, something resilient, something rooted. He opened his mouth to respond, but the boat jolted as they caught a sudden crosswind, and he lost his balance. Panic lanced through him as his foot slipped, and the world tilted. His hands scrabbled for purchase, but the deck offered nothing. The sound of rushing water filled his ears, then the impact cold and shocking and immediate. Salt water rushed into his mouth and nose, blinding and choking. The world became motion and noise and fear. His limbs thrashed instinctively, but he couldn't find the surface. All he could feel was the weight of water pressing against him, holding him down. A memory sliced through him, vivid and unwelcome. A boy, much younger, flailing in a swimming pool, the sound of his mother's voice distant and panicked as arms reached for him too late. Then hands gripped his shoulders. Firm, commanding. He was hauled upward, broken into sunlight and air again, coughing and gasping as Maren's voice pierced through the pounding in his ears. "Breathe, Luke. I've got you. Breathe." He clung to her without shame, water streaming from his face, chest heaving as he sucked in air that tasted like life and salt. Her arms were around him, steadying him against the hull, and her voice was low and calm and close to his ear. "You're okay. I've got you. You're okay." He didn't answer. Couldn't. He buried his face against her shoulder, hating the weakness but needing the contact, the heat of her, the steady rhythm of her breath. Eventually, his shivering slowed. His pulse settled. He leaned back just enough to look at her. "I haven't been in deep water since I was 10, he admitted, his voice hoarse. "You didn't say that." "I thought I could handle it." Maren touched his cheek, brushing wet hair away from his eyes. Her fingers were warm. Her expression was unreadable, but not unkind. "You don't have to prove anything out here," she said. "Not to me, not to anyone." He watched her for a long moment. Her face was too close, or maybe just close enough. "Then why do I feel like I just failed some kind of test?" Maren's lips curved, not quite a smile. "Because you're used to tests you can study for. This one's different. The sea teaches with fear sometimes, but it also teaches you how to let go." She helped him back into the boat, her touch lingering a little longer than necessary. He didn't mind. Something had shifted between them, subtle but irrevocable. He wasn't sure if it was the ocean that had cracked him open or Maren. But as they drifted in the rising sun, Luke Thorne realized he was no longer steering anything. And for the first time, he wondered if that might actually be the point. The air had thickened with the promise of rain, the kind that came sudden and fierce off the Atlantic. The clouds overhead were not yet bruised, but the wind had shifted, carrying a deeper chill and the metallic scent of approaching weather. Luke stood beside Maren at the edge of the dock, rolling up his sleeves as she handed him a coil of heavy rope. The marina swayed gently, boats rocking and straining against their moorings like anxious animals sensing something on the horizon. They had worked side by side for over an hour, moving in tandem without the need for many words. Luke had learned to mirror Maren's pace, quick and efficient, her gestures stripped of waste. The salt wet boards beneath their feet were slick, and she moved across them with feline precision, barefoot and sure. He watched the way her calves flexed as she bent to tighten a line, the corded muscle beneath tanned skin, her hair dark with moisture and pulled back with a red bandana that looked as though it had lived 100 summers. He didn't mind the silence. Not with her. There was something peaceful in the rhythm of working together toward a tangible goal, of anchoring what could not be tamed. It was the opposite of architectural work, where he labored over blueprints and ideas that took months to manifest. Here, the results were immediate. A knot held, or it didn't. A line was tight, or it wasn't. The wind told you the truth whether you were ready or not. "You're catching on," she said finally, her voice raised slightly to cut through the wind. Luke gave a wry smile as he fastened the last tie on the final sailboat. "I follow instructions well, especially when the instructor might throw me into the sea again." She smirked and shook her head. "You fell in all on your own. I just happened to be the rescue crew." He took a step toward her, brushing a damp curl off his forehead. "Still, thanks for that." Marin's eyes held his for a moment. They were the color of sea glass, not quite green, not quite blue, and in this shifting light they seemed to change with every passing gust. She glanced down at her hands, flexing them as if to shake out the tension. "Storm's moving in faster than they said," she murmured. "Feels like a snap front." Luke looked up at the sky, where clouds were building muscle, thickening into something darker and more deliberate. The wind picked up, bringing with it the deep, rhythmic slap of waves against the dock. Far out on the water, gulls wheeled low, their cries sharper, more urgent. "We should get inside," she said. "Quick rinse and a drink if you're up for it. No use driving back until the worst passes." He nodded, letting her lead the way past the dock and along a narrow footpath that curved behind the marina office. She had a small cottage tucked behind the boat shed, a weathered thing with blue shutters and a low-sloped roof that seemed to welcome storms like an old friend. The screen door creaked as they stepped inside, and the scent of salt and lemon oil wrapped around him like warmth. The space was small but alive. Maps curled along the walls, pinned in places with shells and bits of driftwood. A wool blanket hung over a chair near the fireplace, frayed at the edges but clean and soft. Her boots were tucked neatly beneath a bench near the door, next to a row of damp life jackets. There was no attempt at perfection, no obsessive curation. The room breathed like she did. "Give me your jacket," she said, already tossing her soaked one over a hook. "I'll grab towels." Luke peeled his off and handed it to her, his fingertips brushing hers. Just a second of contact, but the warmth of it lingered. He watched her disappear down a short hallway, then turned to the small window above the sink. Rain had started to fall, light and silver, barely more than a mist, but insistent. The sky was darkening at the edges, swallowing the coast one hill at a time. She returned with a towel slung over each shoulder and a bottle of whiskey in one hand. Her hair was looser now, curls damp and unruly around her cheekbones. She handed him a towel and nodded toward the fireplace. "It doesn't bite," she said. "Go warm up." He sat cross-legged on the floor while she lit the fire. The smell of wood smoke rose quickly, earthy and comforting. When she handed him a glass, their fingers touched again, and this time she didn't pull away as quickly. "To surviving the sea," she said, clinking her glass lightly against his. He took a sip. The whiskey was smoky and smooth, with a burn that unfurled in his chest like courage. He let out a soft breath and watched the flames crackle. "I never liked the water," he said. "Even before the near drowning, I was always more comfortable with edges and lines, solid ground, control." Marin looked at him over the rim of her glass. "And yet you married a woman who loved the ocean?" He gave a humorless chuckle. Margot loved the idea of the ocean. She liked linen sundresses and beachfront brunches, not sea spray and mildew and bracing gales. "You built this house for her, didn't you?" Marin asked. Luke didn't answer immediately. He stared into the fire, watching the way the light twisted around the logs. I built it for both of us. I thought if I made something strong enough, beautiful enough, it would hold us together. Marin's voice was quiet when she replied, Houses don't keep people from leaving. I know that now. She leaned back against the arm of the sofa, her legs stretched out, toes bare, one foot brushing his ankle lightly. The contact felt accidental, but she didn't move it. Neither did he. What about you? He asked. You seem like you belong to this place. Was there ever someone? Marin took another sip of her drink, eyes fixed on the dancing firelight. For a moment he thought she might deflect, joke it away like she often did. But then she said, There was a man, years ago, before I started teaching. We were going to sail down the coast, maybe to the Keys, maybe farther. We talked about it like a dream we'd already lived. What happened? She traced the rim of her glass with one finger. He drowned. The boat overturned during a storm. I survived because I was strapped in. He wasn't. The room went still except for the fire and the distant whisper of rain on the roof. Luke reached out and laid his hand on hers, gentle and steady. Her fingers curled beneath his. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him then, eyes unreadable. So am I. But not for loving him. Not even for losing him. Just for not being able to save him. Their hands remained joined, and something shifted in the space between them, something soft and perilous. He moved closer without thinking, the fire warming one side of his face while the nearness of her pulled at something more vulnerable. Her breath caught, almost imperceptibly, and she tilted her face toward his. Their lips hovered, barely apart. His hand moved to her jaw, thumb brushing the corner of her mouth. The tension between them stretched thin, electric and fragile. Then the shrill ring of her phone shattered the moment. Marin pulled away, blinking as though surfacing from deep water. She stood and crossed the room to silence the call, her back to him. Luke remained by the fire, the echo of her warmth still clinging to his skin, the taste of almost still lingering on his tongue. He didn't know whether to feel grateful or cheated. Outside, the storm began to build in earnest. Inside, something had begun to build too, quieter but no less dangerous. And it wasn't finished with either of them. The following morning was full of stillness, the kind that hangs in the air after a storm has passed, when everything is too quiet and the world seems to be holding its breath. The ground was soft beneath Luke's boots as he walked the edge of the property, the grass bent and heavy with moisture, the soil releasing the scent of earth and sea in equal measure. The wind had gentled overnight, leaving only the occasional low groan of trees swaying lazily above the cliffside. It might have been beautiful if not for the damage. He paused beside a stack of lumber, tarped near the half-built deck. The tarp had come loose in the wind, flapping like a half-remembered warning. Luke crouched, pulling it back to assess the wood, only to find water pooled beneath, the ends of several boards warped from rain. He cursed under his breath, yanking one free and running a hand over its surface. It had been custom-milled, expensive, shipped from a supplier that was now on backorder for at least 3 weeks. He stood, fisting the wet cloth of the tarp with frustration, jaw tight. The delay would push everything, backframing, roofing, inspection. This house, this clean start, already felt like it was fighting him, or maybe he was just fighting himself. Either way, the rhythm he had started to find here, the sense of forward momentum, was slipping. He barely heard the crunch of gravel behind him until Marin's voice rang out. You're going to split your knuckles if you keep squeezing that tarp like it owes you something. He turned to find her striding toward him, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder, a to-go cup of coffee in each hand. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her hair pulled into a loose braid over one shoulder. She wore an oversized fleece that looked like it belonged to someone else. Maybe it had. Somehow it made her look smaller, even though she walked like she took up space on purpose. Luke exhaled and wiped his hands on his jeans. The lumber's ruined. I should have double-covered it. She passed him a coffee, her fingers brushing his. You couldn't have predicted a pressure drop that sharp, Storm came in too fast. Even the fishermen were caught off guard. He took a sip. It was black and scalding, exactly what he needed. Still sets the timeline back. Materials like that aren't exactly stocked at the local hardware store. Marin tilted her head, considering him. Actually, I know someone who might be able to help. Sawmill upriver, about an hour from here. Old place, but they'll cut to order, and they've got some beautiful cedar and spruce. Luke blinked. And they deliver? They'd load it if we pick it up. He raised an eyebrow. You're volunteering me for a field trip? Her lips curved. I'm offering you a solution. You could stand here and glare at wood all day, or we could take the boat and go make something happen. Luke looked toward the ocean, then back at her. You mean sail? Yeah. Got a problem with that? He hesitated, just for a breath. No, I just didn't expect to be hauling lumber by sea today. Marin gave him a grin that was far too satisfied. Life rarely asks for permission. By midday, they were gliding past the coastal mouth of the river, the sailboat carving through smooth, dark water that reflected the late autumn sun in glittering ripples. Luke sat across from her, the boat steady now that they were shielded from the open sea. Trees leaned over the riverbanks, their leaves a tapestry of burnished gold and rust red, the kind of color that only existed for a moment before the world faded to gray. He had taken off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and leaned back into the gentle sway of the boat. There was something calming about the motion here, less aggressive than the open ocean, almost meditative. The air was damp and cool but not biting, and the silence between them, for once, was companionable. Marin had loosened her braid, and her hair danced in the breeze, strands catching the sun like strands of copper. She glanced at him over her shoulder. You're getting better at not looking like you're about to hurl. I might be finding my sea legs, he admitted. She laughed, low and warm. It's only taken, 3 times in the water? 2.5. They shared a smile, and something unspoken passed between them. Not heavy, not urgent, just present. The sawmill appeared around a slow bend, nestled among a cluster of weathered buildings. The dock was crooked and creaking, but the air was rich with the scent of cut timber and resin. As they tied off the boat, an older man emerged from the shop, wiping his hands on a rag and squinting at them through thick glasses. Callahan, he greeted Marin. Didn't expect to see you before winter. I need a favor, Ray, she said. You still cutting cedar? For you? Always. While Marin spoke with Ray, Luke wandered into the yard, running his hands over neatly stacked planks. The smell of fresh wood was sharp and clean, a stark contrast to the damp decay he'd found under the tarp that morning. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing it in. It reminded him of the early days of architecture school, the long hours in dusty studios, the scent of sawdust and glue and ambition. Marin returned with a slip of paper and a satisfied look. They'll prep it this afternoon, she said. We can load first thing in the morning. Luke nodded. Thanks, really. She shrugged, but there was something softer in her eyes. Sometimes the best plans are the ones you didn't draw. On the way back, the wind had shifted again, and the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the water. Marin leaned back, legs stretched out, her foot brushing his knee now and then with the rhythm of the boat. They didn't speak much, letting the quiet settle between them like something earned. As they reached the bay, the coastline unfolded ahead, familiar now in the way a lived-in room becomes. The silhouette of the half-built house stood waiting, no longer just a project, but something more alive. Back at the dock, Luke reached for the lines before she could. I've got it, he said. She gave him a curious look, but stepped aside, watching him knot the rope. It wasn't perfect, but it held. They stood for a moment, side by side, gazing out over the water. The sky was streaked with lavender and pale gold, the sun dipping low behind the hills. The wind was cool on his face, carrying the scent of rain-soaked wood and something faintly floral from the nearby shore. I needed today, he said quietly. So did I. He looked at her, her profile strong in the fading light, lips parted slightly as though she might say something else, but she didn't. Instead, she turned and walked toward the house, her shadow long and steady behind her. Luke stood for a moment longer before following. The dock creaked beneath his steps, and the breeze tugged at the hem of his shirt, playful now, as if it knew a secret he had yet to learn. The sky was a dome of brushed gold and pearl as the afternoon light filtered through low clouds, warm and drowsy as it reached through the unfinished windows of the coastal house. Luke leaned over the long pine table he had claimed as a drafting station, tracing lines on the newest iteration of the porch design. His pencil moved slowly, pausing to rework the angles, not because he had made an error, but because something still didn't feel right. The geometry was sound, the function was logical, but the feeling, that elusive breath of something more than architecture, still evaded him. Behind him, the sound of boots on unfinished floorboards reached his ears, deliberate and unhurried. Marin appeared in the doorway without announcement, wind-touched and vivid, a charcoal gray sweater rolled to her elbows, cheeks flushed from the sea air. Her eyes scanned the table, and without greeting, she stepped closer, her fingers brushing the edge of the blueprint. "You still trying to box the wind?" she asked, her voice quiet but threaded with amusement. Luke straightened, setting the pencil down and stretching his arms overhead. His shoulders ached in the pleasant way they did after good work, the kind that settled into your muscles and reminded you you'd been present. "I'm trying to tame it," he said, "or at least suggest it flow around the house instead of through it." Marin walked slowly around the table, her fingers trailing over the sketch with absent curiosity. Her scent reached him before she did, subtle and familiar sea salt and citrus and something like pine needles warmed by sun. She didn't ask before dragging the stool beside him, lowering herself onto it and leaning in until her shoulder touched his lightly. "Tell me what this line is doing," she said, tapping the far corner of the drawing. "It's a windbreak," he replied. "Glass, extending from the porch to reduce gusts from the north. I thought it would protect the space without fully enclosing it." She studied the line, brows pulled in concentration. Her hand moved to the margin of the page, where she gently rotated the paper, turning it until it faced her. She reached for his pencil and, with the easy authority of someone who had spent a lifetime trusting her own instincts, began to sketch a counterpoint. Her line curved. It was a graceful arc that caught the edge of the porch, scooped inward, and then trailed off toward the stairs, suggesting movement instead of blocking it. When she finished, she leaned back and looked at him. "You're still resisting it," she said softly. "The wind isn't something to fight. You work with it. You let it tell you where it wants to go, and then you design something that lets it through, but softer. You invite it in and ask it to be a guest." He stared at her addition for a moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. "I didn't think to ask the wind for permission." Marin met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Most people don't, but you're not most people." Something in her tone made his skin warm. He watched her as she reached forward again, making another small mark, this one near the outer decking. "What's that?" he asked. "A wind chime anchor," she said. "Right there, where the breeze breaks from the west. You'll hear it all day. Not loud, just enough to remind you that the house is breathing." He leaned closer, their heads almost touching. "You think of things like that?" "I have to," she said. "Out there, on the water. If you ignore the little details, you get caught off guard. You listen to the wind, the hull, the sails. Every creak has meaning." Luke was quiet for a long beat. Then, without turning his head, he said, "I think I was building this place to keep the world out." "And now?" she asked, her voice soft. "Now I think I want to let it in." Carefully. Their eyes met, and this time neither of them looked away. Her breath slowed, and so did his, as if they had entered a different current, one beneath the surface of all the others. There was nothing showy about the moment, no grand gesture. Just the weight of her knee pressing lightly against his under the table, the scent of her skin in the quiet, and the thrum of something unnamed gathering between them. She reached out and picked up his hand, turning it palm up. Her fingers brushed the calluses forming along his fingertips, remnants of the weeks spent hammering, hauling, tying rope. Her thumb moved slowly across the pad of his thumb. "You're changing," she said. "I don't think you realize how much." "I feel it," he admitted. "I don't know what it means yet, but I feel it." Her gaze dropped to his mouth, then returned to his eyes. She leaned in without hesitation, her hair brushing against his cheek as her lips found his. It was a soft kiss, at first, one that tasted like firelight and salt, like days spent chasing something elemental across a sky you can't predict. Her lips parted slightly against his, inviting him to respond, and he did. His hand slid to her jaw, drawing her closer. The kiss deepened, slow and searching, not hurried or desperate. It was the kind of kiss that came after days of unspoken understanding, after nights of glances held too long and conversations that said too much in silence. Her hands found his chest, fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, and he breathed her name against her mouth like it meant something more than a sound. When they finally pulled apart, it wasn't with a jolt, but a soft exhale. Marin's eyes were darker, the sea glass edges shadowed by emotion. "I shouldn't have done that," she murmured. "Why not?" he asked, his voice rough. "Because this," she gestured between them, "doesn't follow plans. And I think you like plans." He reached out, brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "I'm starting to think the best parts of life come without them." She looked at him, and he thought she might say something more, but then she rose, slow and careful, her body still close enough that he could feel the heat of her against him. "I need to get back to the dock," she said. "They're expecting me for a lesson in half an hour." Luke stood as well. He wanted to reach for her again, to ground them in the moment, but he stopped himself. Instead, he said, "Will you come back later? We can sketch more." Her lips lifted, almost a smile. "I'll come back, but only if you let me keep bending the lines." He watched her walk down the steps of the half-finished porch and disappear into the slanting light. The house behind him creaked in the wind, a low groan of wood shifting in response to the changes around it. He looked at the blueprints again, now laced with her curves, her softness, her intuition. Maybe not all plans needed to be straight, to be strong. And maybe he didn't either. The storm arrived like a whisper that became a roar, sudden and without apology. By dusk, the sky had surrendered to a boiling charcoal mass, the first drops of rain hurling themselves against the unfinished walls with a desperation that sounded almost human. Thunder cracked, not distant and romantic, but sharp and violent, as if something overhead was tearing apart. Luke had stayed late at the house, finishing details on the revised frame of the porch. Marin's suggestions had made their way into the new sketches, her fingerprints subtle in every line, her voice now echoing in his own decisions. He had just stepped inside to avoid the wind when it became clear the storm would not pass politely. The glassless window frames funneled gusts of salty wind through the open structure, and the half-placed beams above creaked in protest. He gathered the tarps, weighing them with sandbags and instinct, moving fast and muttering curses as the rain intensified. Thunder pulsed again, closer now, the kind that makes you feel like the sky might fall if it's angry enough. Then, headlights cut through the driving mist. A low truck pulled up the sloping gravel, and the door opened before the engine stopped. Marin jumped out in a dark rain jacket, her hair pulled into a knot that was already falling apart from the wind. "You shouldn't be here," she called out. Luke looked at her from the skeleton of the porch, soaked through, strands of wet hair plastered to his forehead. "Neither should you." She ignored that, jogging toward him with water splashing around her boots, then climbing the half-steps into the shelter of the structure. "I saw the radar. This cell's bad. And the frame." She glanced up at the exposed beams swaying slightly above them. "It's not ready to take this." "I couldn't leave it uncovered." Her eyes met his, her face wet but flushed with something more than just cold. "You always have to be the one holding the roof up, don't you?" He didn't answer, just pulled another tarp tight and secured it. She moved beside him, helping him knot the edges. Their fingers brushed, slick with rain and trembling from the cold, but neither pulled back. She stepped closer, sheltering beneath the same section of the wall, her breath coming fast and visible in the dim light. The wind howled through the gaps, slamming a sheet of plywood against the far wall with a bang that made them both flinch. Luke reached out instinctively, his arm moving around her back, anchoring her even though she had not asked for it. She didn't move away. Her shoulder pressed against his chest, and for a moment all the sounds outside became part of a distant world. He spoke low, close to her ear. "You think we'll lose the frame?" She shook her head. "Not tonight. If the wind shifts, maybe. But it's you I'm worried about." Luke exhaled. The warmth of it caught between them. Her skin smelled like wet cedar and salt, and something warmer that lived just beneath the storm. "I'm not fragile," he said. "No," she murmured. "But you're human." He looked at her, the space between them suddenly electric, charged not just with proximity but with everything they had not said over the past few days. There was something in the air that made it impossible to lie, not to her and not to himself. "I've been trying so hard to stay fixed," he said, "to be the blueprint, the thing that doesn't shift when everything else does." She tilted her face toward him. "And how's that working out?" He laughed, low and rough. "About as well as nailing down the tide." Another crack of thunder ripped across the sky, this one directly overhead. The power of it shook the beams and pressed their bodies closer together. His hand found the small of her back, not with urgency, but with an ache that had built slowly over long hours and half-said truths. "I don't want to hold anything up right now," he said. "I just want." She kissed him before he could finish, her mouth warm despite the cold, her lips wet and searching. He kissed her back, pulling her in with both arms now, one hand at the nape of her neck, the other sliding over the curve of her back as though relearning touch from scratch. Her body folded against his like they were built from the same broken mold, molded by wind and salt and something that refused to be defined by logic. Rain lashed sideways through the windows, soaking the floor beneath them, but they didn't move. Her hands moved beneath his soaked shirt, fingertips tracing the ridges of muscle, lingering at the places where old tension had carved its memory. She didn't rush, she explored. And Luke, who had been unmoored for so long, felt like something had just dropped anchor inside his chest. They kissed like they had time, like the storm around them was just the background to something that mattered more. When they broke apart, they stayed close, forehead to forehead, their breath tangled, their skin cold but their cores burning. She didn't speak, neither did he. They moved together into the partially sheltered alcove where he had kept the camping blankets and spare gear for days like this. She tugged off his wet shirt with a tenderness that made his stomach clench. He returned the gesture, unzipping her rain jacket and peeling it away, then helping her out of the sweater beneath. Their clothes dropped onto the tarp-covered floor like offerings to the storm. The rest happened in silence, with only the sound of wind against wood and rain on tarp to bear witness. Their bodies came together with a kind of reverence, an intimacy that had more to do with presence than possession. She guided his hand with hers, slow and sure, and he followed her rhythm as though it had always lived beneath his skin, waiting to be remembered. Afterward, they lay curled beneath a rough wool blanket, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing the bare length of her spine in slow, languid circles. The storm raged on, but it seemed distant now, as though they had found the eye of it, a place untouched by fury. Marin spoke first, her voice quiet. "This doesn't change anything, you know." He turned his head toward her. "Why does it have to?" She didn't answer right away. Her fingers moved over his chest, following the shape of an old scar there. "Because if we pretend it doesn't mean something, then maybe it won't hurt if it ends." He caught her hand, kissed her knuckles. "Or we can admit it does mean something and take the risk." She closed her eyes. He could feel the battle behind her silence. Outside, the rain began to soften, tapping gently now instead of pounding. The wind quieted too, as if they had passed through the worst of it. Marin shifted slightly, pressing her lips to the hollow of his collarbone. "Let's just be here for now." Luke held her tighter, breathing her in, the scent of salt and skin and something else that felt like home. For now, he thought. And maybe that was enough. The following morning dawned in soft watercolor hues, the sky washed clean by the storm's fury. A low mist clung to the hills and drifted between the trees like breath held too long. The house stood quiet, its exposed frame creaking in gentle protest as it dried beneath a tentative sun. Inside, a sense of stillness lingered, the kind that follows after something intense and unspoken has taken place. Luke lay awake long before the light filtered through the skeletal beams. Marin's head rested on his chest, one leg tangled with his, her arm folded across his stomach. Her breath was even steady, brushing his skin with each slow exhale. Her warmth anchored him, more grounding than the floor beneath them. The storm had passed, but something else had moved through them, rearranged the space between what was and what could be. He didn't want to move, didn't want to break the delicate balance of this moment. But eventually, she stirred, stretching slightly, her fingers grazing the curve of his ribs before she lifted her head. Her eyes, still heavy with sleep, met his. "Morning," she said softly, her voice husky and low. "Hey," he replied, brushing a damp curl from her temple. They didn't say more than that. Didn't need to. She pressed a kiss to his chest, then sat up, wrapping the blanket around herself and scanning the quiet gray-blue of the world outside the unfinished walls. "I should check the boats," she said after a long moment. Luke nodded, sitting up and reaching for his clothes. "I'll come with you." But something shifted in the way she looked at him just then. A flicker of uncertainty passed across her face, gone before he could name it. She stood and began pulling on her sweater and jeans without looking back at him. By the time they reached the dock, the fog had thinned into ribbons, lifting gently from the water's surface. The boats bobbed lazily, unharmed but restless, as if they too had weathered something more than wind and rain. Marin moved with purpose, checking knots, adjusting slack lines, muttering to herself as she ran her hands over wet canvas and polished wood. Luke followed, unsure whether to touch or stay back. "You okay?" he asked finally. She looked up at him, squinting into the light, then nodded. "Yeah, just tired." He wasn't convinced, but he let it be. Later that afternoon, he returned to the house alone to meet with Mason and go over the new delivery from the sawmill. The truck had already come and gone, leaving behind fresh-cut cedar stacked neatly under plastic. Luke ran a hand over one of the beams, its surface smooth and fragrant, the grain catching the light in subtle golden waves. He should have felt satisfied. Progress was happening. The house was coming together, but the space felt empty without her. He was laying out measurements when the crunch of tires on gravel caught his attention. He looked up to see a sleek silver car pulling into the drive, far too polished to belong to anyone local. The door opened, and a woman stepped out, tall and composed, with a caramel coat that skimmed her knees and hair pulled back in a style that spoke of city salons and dry champagne. It took a heartbeat for Luke to recognize her. Margot. She smiled, faint and uncertain, as she closed the car door. "Hi, Luke." He stood slowly. "Margot, I didn't expect... how did you? I was nearby, visiting friends in Portland. I thought I'd stop by." Her eyes moved over the frame of the house, the skeleton rising in familiar angles. "I had to see it again." Luke shifted uncomfortably. "It's still in pieces." Her gaze returned to him. "So are we." He didn't know what to say to that. Margot walked closer, her heels sharp against the gravel. She peered through the open entryway, her eyes catching on the lines of the new design. "It's different," she said. "More open, more wind." Luke folded his arms. Things needed to change. "Do you think it'll sell?" she asked, glancing at him sidelong. "Eventually, I mean, when it's done." He hesitated. "That was the plan. But maybe now you're not so sure?" He looked at her then, really looked. Margot had always been composed, always impeccable. But now, standing in the house they had once dreamed into existence, she looked smaller, as if she didn't quite know where to place her hands or her eyes. "You didn't come here to talk about the house," he said quietly. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "No, I didn't." He waited, the air thick between them. "I thought about you," she said finally. "When the divorce was final, I thought maybe we made a mistake. Maybe we just didn't try hard enough." Luke's throat tightened. "We tried. We just weren't the right shape anymore." Margot stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "Maybe you still are. Maybe this place could be a new start." Before he could answer, a voice called from behind the frame. "Luke, you in there?" He turned. Marin stood at the edge of the path, hair windblown, cheeks pink, boots streaked with mud. She froze as her eyes landed on Margot's hand resting lightly on his arm. The world stilled. "Marin," he said, stepping back. "It's not what it looks like." But she had already turned, walking away with fast, sharp steps that made the gravel scatter beneath her boots. Luke didn't think. He moved, jogging after her, calling her name, but she didn't slow, didn't look back. She reached her truck and yanked the door open. "Please," he said, breathless. "Let me explain." She paused, her fingers curled tight around the doorframe. "You don't owe me anything," she said, her voice rougher than he had ever heard it. "And I don't have a right to be mad. But seeing her there, touching you like that, like she still belonged," she shook her head. I need some space." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away, not with anger, but with sorrow. "Don't go," he said. Marin's eyes found his, and in them he saw something unraveling. "I already did," she whispered, and then she was gone. Luke stood alone in the settling dust, the sound of her truck fading into the quiet afternoon. The cedar beams still waited, the house still unfinished, the breeze still moving through it all. But for the first time since he had returned, Luke felt like the house had hollowed out again, not from broken wood or missing glass, but from the sudden absence of her. The days after Marin left stretched long and hollow, like the space between unfinished rafters where something essential had once hung. The coastal house, which had begun to take shape under his hands, now seemed to resist him. Each nail he drove felt duller, each line he sketched a little less certain. Even the sea, once so immediate and alive, seemed distant now, dulled behind a fog of absence. Luke rose earlier than usual, worked later than necessary, kept his hands busy so his mind would not unravel. He did not call her. He did not know if he should. The memory of her expression, that flicker of disbelief and betrayal, so quickly shuddered into something colder, returned to him at odd moments, when he was pouring coffee, when he was shaving, when the wind shifted and carried her name through the bare studs of the house as though the structure itself missed her. Mason noticed. Of course he did. On the third day, as they stood side by side, measuring for the new porch rail, Mason finally spoke. "She's gone, huh?" Luke didn't look up from the blueprint. "She needed space," Mason grunted. That's usually code for, "I'm hurt," but too proud to say it out loud. Luke didn't answer. "You planning to go after her?" Mason asked, voice steady, no judgment in it. Luke set down the pencil and looked out at the ocean. The sky was gunmetal blue, clouds layered thick like old wool. "I don't know where she went." Mason nodded slowly. "Well, if it were me, I'd check the harbor first. Marin doesn't usually disappear. She sails." That night, Luke lay awake in the half-framed bedroom, listening to the wind push through the open walls. It no longer felt like an invitation. It felt like morning. He closed his eyes and remembered her voice, the curve of her finger drawing wind paths on his blueprint, the way she had looked at him like she saw not who he was, but who he could be. He didn't deserve that kind of belief, but he wanted it anyway. By morning, he had made up his mind. The marina was quiet when he arrived, a late-morning hush settling over the water, broken only by the call of gulls and the occasional clink of rigging against mast. He moved through the docks with a purpose he had not felt in days, scanning the slips until he found what he was looking for. Her boat was still there, but it was packed. Coiled ropes, sealed canvas duffels, a cooler strapped down near the stern. The sails were half-rigged. She was leaving. Marin stood at the bow, tying off a weathered bag. She wore a deep green jacket, and her hair was pulled back in a tight braid, tucked beneath a wool cap. She hadn't noticed him yet. Luke stepped onto the dock, his boots echoing on the planks. She turned at the sound, startled for a moment, her body stiffening. Then her face settled into something unreadable. "I figured you'd be gone already," she said. "I didn't know where to find you," he replied, "until I realized I did." She didn't smile. "You shouldn't be here." "I had to come," he said. "I didn't explain. I didn't stop you, and I should have." Marin turned away, busying her hands with a line that didn't need fixing. Luke moved closer. "Margot showed up uninvited. She's not staying. She's not what I want. Not anymore." "She still touched you like she could," Marin said without looking up. "Like she had the right." "She had no right," he said. "She was looking for something familiar, something we lost a long time ago. I was surprised to see her, but it didn't mean anything." Marin tied the line in a perfect figure 8, pulled it tight, then let her hands fall to her sides. "I know I don't have a claim on you," she said softly, "but it hurt, seeing her there, in the place I had started to think of as ours." Luke exhaled, slow and aching. "It is ours, if you want it to be." She turned then, finally meeting his eyes. "You don't build a house with just walls and windows, Luke. You build it with trust, with space for someone else to breathe." "I know," he said. "I didn't before, but I do now. You taught me that." A silence opened between them. The wind lifted the edge of her braid and blew it across her cheek. She didn't brush it away. "I thought I could sail away and forget what it felt like," she whispered. "But the closer I got to leaving, the more I realized it's not the sea I'm running toward. It's you I'm running from." He stepped onto the boat, his boots landing with a soft thud beside hers. "Then stay," he said. "Don't run. Let's figure this out." Marin's mouth trembled. She turned her face to the water, then back to him. "You still planning to sell the house?" she asked. "No," he said without hesitation. "It doesn't feel like a project anymore. It feels like a beginning." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She crossed her arms, trying to hide the way her fingers shook. "And if it falls down again? If it gets torn apart?" "Then we rebuild it," he said. "The right way, this time. Together." She stared at him for a long moment, then stepped forward and rested her forehead against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. Her breath hitched, and he held her tighter. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Me too," he said, "but I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." She laughed, watery and small. "That might be the most romantic thing you've ever said." He kissed the top of her head, then her forehead, then finally her mouth, soft and sure. This kiss was different from the ones before. It didn't ask for permission. It didn't apologize. It simply was. When they parted, Marin looked up at him with new steadiness. "So," she said, "we going home?" Luke smiled. "Yeah, let's go home." They stepped off the boat together, side by side. The dock groaned beneath their weight, but the sky had cleared, and the sea shimmered under a pale sun that promised something not yet certain but full of possibility. For the first time, Luke didn't look back. He looked forward, toward the house, toward her, toward everything they were about to build. The final nail sank into the wood with a satisfying thunk, echoing softly through the open space where the last of the scaffolding had just come down. Luke stood back and let the hammer fall from his hand to the porch railing, exhaling as the weight of months left his shoulders all at once. The house was finished. Not perfect, not pristine, but whole, and alive in a way he had never imagined when he first set foot back in Breakwater Bay. The coastal wind wound its way through the slatted shutters, now painted a shade of gray that looked almost blue in the morning light. It whispered across the cedar deck, rustling the seagrasses that Marin had planted by hand. The porch, once a clean square in his original designs, now curved gently with the land, embracing the view rather than commanding it. Glass panels framed the wide ocean beyond, but not so much as to shut it out, and at the western corner a chime hung from a driftwood bracket, singing faintly with every gust, its tones low and resonant, like a voice murmuring secrets only the wind understood. Luke ran a hand over the polished railing, its surface warm from the sun. He heard laughter rise from the backyard and followed the sound around the house, boots crunching on the gravel path that curved through dune grass and native shrubs. Marin stood at a long table, draped in linen, arranging plates beside a spread of grilled fish, warm bread, and citrus-dressed greens. She wore a sleeveless white top knotted at her waist, and her hair was pulled into a messy braid, strands slipping free to catch the sunlight. She was barefoot, of course, her toes sunk into the sandy edge of the lawn. There were smudges of flour on her cheek, and a bottle of white wine cooling in a metal bucket beside her. A small crowd gathered under the open pergola, strung with lights, locals, people he had come to know over the weeks. Mason stood with a beer in hand, his laugh loud and wide, while a woman from the bakery balanced a tray of tarts on her hip. A pair of kids darted between the legs of adults, chasing each other with shells and giggles. Marin looked up and saw him. Her face softened into a smile that still made his chest tighten in the best way. She walked toward him, wiping her hands on a towel, and reached for his wrist with a familiarity that always felt new. She turned his hand palm up and ran her thumb over the fading calluses there. "Looks like you finally finished," she said. "I had good help." She kissed him once, brief and warm. "Come eat, you've earned it." As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the lawn, Luke found himself leaning back in a deck chair beside the fire pit, a drink in his hand, and the sound of the ocean blending with conversation and quiet music playing from a speaker tucked somewhere among the potted rosemary. The scent of grilled fish and wood smoke clung to the salt air, comforting and sharp. Every so often the wind shifted and brought the soft chime of the bell into the mix, that low-bellied sound grounding the space in something that felt timeless. Marin moved through the crowd with ease, barefoot and glowing, pausing to laugh with one person, to refill a glass for another. She was the kind of woman who never hovered, but who left warmth in her wake like the trail of a comet. Luke watched her with the quiet reverence of someone who understood how lucky he was to be in her orbit at all. She had not asked to stay. She had not made promises or demanded them, but she had unpacked her things one morning without saying a word, and there had been a toothbrush beside his that night. That was how she moved through the world, with intention, not performance. Eventually, the guests thinned, one by one drifting off with hugs and half-empty dishes packed under arms. The sky above deepened into velvet, stars just beginning to peek through the fading lavender. Luke helped Marin gather the glasses, their fingers brushing over smooth stems and folded napkins. She leaned into him as they stood in the doorway of the kitchen, resting her head against his shoulder, their bodies swaying faintly to the rhythm of a slow song still playing outside. "Remember the first night we worked on the porch?" she asked softly. He nodded. "You drew a curve across my perfect square, told me I couldn't shut the wind out. You listened. I should have listened sooner." She tilted her face toward him. You were ready when you were ready. He kissed her then, slow and unhurried. She tasted of wine and sea, air, and something unnameable, something that felt like a promise that didn't need words. Later, they sat side by side on the edge of the porch, legs swinging over the sandy drop toward the slope of dune and seagrass. The moon had risen, brushing the water with pale light. The chime above them sang again, stirred by a sudden breeze that rolled in from the open sea. Luke glanced at her profile, the strong line of her jaw softened by night. Do you miss it, being out there? She didn't answer right away. Sometimes, she said, but I've learned the wind shows up in more places than just the water. I don't need a sail to feel like I'm moving. He took her hand, lacing their fingers. Her grip was sure. I still have the plans, he said. The original ones, with the straight lines and the closed porch and the big glass wall. Do you? They're folded in the bottom of a drawer in the study. I can't bring myself to throw them away. That's okay, she said. They were the start. But this, she gestured around them, to the curve of the porch, the echo of music still drifting from the deck, the faint scent of rosemary and wood smoke. This is the part you didn't plan, and it's better. Luke looked out over the water, the surface now smooth and gleaming, reflecting stars like scattered coins. It is better, he said. They stayed like that for a long while, listening to the sea, to the creak of the house settling, to the quiet rhythm of their shared breath. The house no longer felt like a monument to something lost. It felt lived in, loved, not in spite of its imperfections, but because of them. Finally, Marin stood, tugging him gently to his feet. Come on, let's go to bed. We've got a tide to catch tomorrow. Luke followed her inside, the screen door closing behind them with a familiar thump. The wind rose again, playful now, curling through the grasses and the open beams of the porch like an old friend invited to stay. The house did not resist. It welcomed.